This time we are going to talk about file policy. This FTD's component is what gives us an option to perform inspection on the files exchanged or just transmitted within a established communications channel. And now in particular, we can look and inspect files traversing through FTP, HTTP, SMTP, IMAP, POP3, and NetBIOS connections. So only those protocols are supported. Other communication like, let's say, Telnet or maybe something encrypted, in those cases, file inspection is not gonna work. Okay, file policy is what we actually use to enable two separate features. We have file control and advanced malware protection, abbreviated as AMP. The file control is what specifically gives us an option to block files of a certain type based on the file's extension. Like, for example, I can block PDFs, but I may want to allow text files through those communications channels. And this is something that requires threat license to be active on our FTD. And then advanced malware protection, the network flavor, this is what we will use to detect different types of malware that can be possibly transmitted for those FTP, HTTP, SMTP, and so on connections. And this one is going to require malware license. So if you want to use file control and advanced malware protection, you will have to activate two different licenses for threats and malware. Right now, it should be clear that file control is something separate from malware inspection, because this feature, this engine gives you an option to block a file no matter if it is infected or not. So in this case, we are not going to be performing any type of antivirus analysis, and we will not be performing any type of cloud lookups. The file control is performed with local engine, and the engine is going to be configured by selecting different categories or just sets of types of files, or maybe individual file types, like, for example, PDF. So you can go for a category like maybe Office documents, and this is going to include several different types of files, like, for example, docs or maybe Excel files. So I can go for a category or I can go for individual file types. Similar concept to what we saw with URL filtering, categories versus individual websites. No cloud lookups in this case. Also notice that if a packet is to be inspected with multiple DPI engines, the file control is going to happen first. So I could potentially enable AMP and intrusion prevention and also file control for a single flow, in which case file control is going to come first, followed by advanced malware protection and finally IPS. This is because file control, it allows us to block files based on their types, no matter if they have malware or not. So it doesn't make any sense to inspect a file looking for malware if the file is eventually to be dropped. In case of advanced malware protection, this is again what we will use to perform inspection looking for malicious code. And now the way that this inspection is going to be performed is by calculating a hash of a file being transmitted and then sending this hash to Cisco Collective Security Intelligence Cloud for comparison. And specifically, this is going to be SHA-256 hash what we will calculate on a file, and this is what FMC is going to send to the AMP cloud to retrieve a disposition or just a reputation of a hash. So this way also a file, because those hashes will be always unique, especially with SHA-256. Yeah, now similar to the URL filtering, our FTD is going to be storing the hash to disposition binding locally in its cache. And the same is going to happen on the FMC. So only if the FTD haven't seen the file, it is going to send a query to the FMC. FMC is going to check its own local cache. If it doesn't have a match for a hash, I mean the hash to disposition binding, we are going to send a query to the AMP cloud. And now in terms of those dispositions or just reputations of a file, The file can be classified as malware, and this verdict is going to be returned by our cloud, or it could be also returned by a local engine. There is going to be something more than just the cloud we will use when making AMP inspection, or at least something that we can potentially enable in addition to using the Cisco cloud. Okay, the disposition can be deemed to be clean, which means that the file is okay. And this verdict can be not only returned by the cloud or a local engine, but we can also statically whitelist files by putting them to a so-called clean list. So I always have a method of overwriting this dynamic decision, like when the cloud says file is bad and I'm gonna block it. If the file is on the clean list, I'm gonna still allow the file, which takes precedence over what the dynamic or local engine said. Plus, I can also do blacklisting with custom detection lists. So if my engine said that the file is known to be good, and I know it is bad, or maybe I don't really want to allow the file through, I'm going to put the file to the custom list. This option is actually commonly used for data loss prevention. Like if you don't want your employees to be able to upload certain files for the network. Okay, it is also possible for the disposition to be unknown, like the cloud doesn't really know if the file is good or bad, or if the cloud is down, the disposition is going to be set to unavailable. It is also possible to extend this default hash-based file analysis with the AMP cloud with other engines. The dynamic option, this is specifically talking about so-called FredGrid cloud. This is what you can enable in order to analyze files that are categorized as unknown when the disposition returned by the cloud, AMP cloud in this case, was set to unknown. Where this dynamic analysis is all about sending that file to this second cloud, FredGrid cloud, which cloud is acting more of like as a sandbox. Okay, so what the FredGrid cloud is going to do is that it's going to take that file, run the file in a virtual environment which is isolated, and it is going to observe what the file is going to do. Like, is it something harmful or not? And then based on that analysis, it is going to return a special score, which score can be then used on the FTD to tell if we want to allow the file or maybe we want to block it. So FredGrid itself doesn't block the file, it just gives you a score, and it also updates the AMP cloud. Okay, then we've got the Spiro engine, which is pure heuristics. This is what it gives you the option of detecting 0-days attacks that are currently unknown, but this one is only going to work for exec files. And then the local engine, this is all about using antivirus. In particular, this is going to be ClamAV, what FTD uses for a local scan on a file. So these engines are optional. This is what you can enable in addition to performing this hash-based analysis. It is also possible to store a file which is being analyzed locally on the FTD's disk. For further inspection, you may want to download the file and perform analysis offline. There's going to be one main prerequisite before you will be able to successfully use and deploy your file policy. It is going to be something which is known as adaptive profiling. This feature must be enabled in the access control policy for the advanced options, and we can take a look at that. Let me just go to our policy. I'm going to show you where to find this setting. Let me just edit the policy. Let's go to advanced, and it's going to be under detection enhancement settings. So adaptive profiles, by default, at least on this version 6.2.2, it is enabled. You can also enable adaptive profile updates. Okay, I'm gonna leave it with this feature enabled without using periodic updates. So this is the main prerequisite for maybe not necessarily configuring file policy, but for making it work. And now when you eventually plan to build a policy, you'll have to go to the policies and select malware and file policy. You will have an option to specify the application, a transfer direction, and also files and categories. Maybe actually, let's take a look at this. Let's go down to the policies, access control, malware, and file. I will want to build this policy either way, so let's do it now. My file policy, it's going to be the name. I'm going to save, and we will now add a rule. And we see those different options here. We have the application protocol. So remember that this feature works for certain protocols, but not all of them. Like I can choose web, I can choose mail, upload, download, I can go for FTP, or I can choose all of them. I can also specify if this is for the upload or download direction. I can go for both as well. I have an action, which is eventually what controls which of the policies you will activate. We will talk about this stuff in just a second. And we have an option to store files. This option is gonna change when you go for advanced malware protection. We will also take a look at that. And now inside of the conditions, I have those different categories, like I can go for, let's say, PDFs, maybe multimedia files. So I can go for the categories, or I may be more selective. Like I'm gonna say, I'm looking for Microsoft Office files, this stuff, which is docx, PowerPoint, and so on. So I can choose it here. So pretty simple type of condition. Okay, then we will have to specify an action, which is again how we will enable file control or maybe advanced malware protection. So now if you want to enable file control, you'll have to either go for detect files option. Let's go back to the rule, which is the default. And this action allows you to log the file under file events. So you'll hit the file policy, file control policy, but the file is gonna be allowed. So it's like you wanna track and log the file exchange. Or you can go for block files, which is how we will perform real blocking. This is how we enable true file control. We will block file based on the category or maybe type. Next, if you want to enable advanced malware protection, we also have two options. I can either go for malware cloud lookup, which is to send a hash to the cloud, but allow the file regardless of the disposition, regardless of the verdict. So even when the cloud says the file is bad, I'm gonna allow the file through. I will log the event, and I can potentially store the file like based on the return disposition. But the key thing is that I will still allow the file through. Notice that this is also when I can enable those additional engines. And there is also what is known as capacity handling, which is all about storing files locally for further dynamic analysis. Okay, and now the way that you will enable real advanced malware protection is when you say block malware. So this is where you will take the verdict into account and make a decision based on that information. Let's look at it. I can say block malware. I can choose additional engines. I can still store those files locally for further analysis. And same as with block files, I can also say that they want to reset the session, just to shut down the socket on the client and on the server, which is actually a recommended option. Okay, so this was the first phase of our configuration. We have to define the policy, add roles, and select the actions. Now, in the second phase, we will have to still activate this policy in the access control policy. And this is going to be specifically done under the inspection tab. And now the key thing to remember here is that your inspection role that you will select for a file policy must be configured with the allow action, but not with trust. And also pre-filtering cannot be configured, well, like the fast pathing, it cannot be enabled for the flow. Because remember that these two, what they do is they actually bypass deep packet inspection, which is your IPS, and file control plus advanced malware protection. So we must go for allow, which is essentially an equivalent of inspect. Verification is going to be performed under analysis and file events. So maybe let's go ahead and take a look at this in our network. What we will do here is that our test server is going to be configured with a web service, and it is going to store two different files. You will have an OK.txt file, and this is what we will want to allow. And we will have a file called myPDF, and this is going to be PDF. And this is what I'm going to say I want to block. And I'm going to test this using R2 as my web client. We're going to use the copy command with the HTTP argument like what we did in several other sessions. Okay, so maybe let's quickly take a look at the access control policy first. I just built a file policy. We just don't have any role inside. Now, but we have a role inside of the access control policy, which allows all inside to outside traffic. And the role is configured with the allow action. So this is exactly what we will need for our policy. So then we can go back to the malware and file policy. Okay, we will add this policy. Maybe let's also take a look at advanced options just to show you what they do here. So this is how we can somehow tune the pulse. And we have what is known as first time analysis. Maybe let's quickly take a look at this in the documentation. This is just to show you how to look up stuff like that, like when you see an option and you're not quite sure what it does. Most of those policies, they are documented in the FMC. We'll go to 6.2.2, and this one you can find the information about it under, I think it's going to be advanced malware protection and file control, this first link here. So we have entries for access control in general. We have stuff like roles, role configuration, HTTP, interactive blocking, security intelligence, DNS policy, pre-filtering, and also some other policies like intrusion detection, prevention, like our network discovery, application detection, network host detection. So this is all network discovery policy. We've got correlation and some other links as well. Okay, if we scroll down here, or let me just Control F and look for first time analysis. It says when this option is disabled, the files that are detected for the first time are going to be marked with an unknown disposition instead of being submitted to the cloud. So we can disable it, and then a new file, a file that wasn't previously seen in the network, is going to be basically initially categorized as unknown, and that is going to be allowed to go through. Okay, this is how we will enable blacklisting. This is whitelisting. And this score here, this threshold here, I should say, this is all about thread grid cloud. So remember that thread grid returns a score, like medium, high. Let's take a look at this. Medium, high, very high. So if you go for medium, it means that you want to block most of the files, because this is the lowest score. So when you set the threshold to be low, you will perform blocking on most of the files that thread grid assumes to have a score of medium or higher. And we can also enable inspection of archives. Okay, but let's just add a rule. It's going to be a simple rule. I'm going to say that the protocol is going to be any, which is going to include HTTP. Direction is going to be both inbound and outbound. We will want to block the file, maybe also copy it locally, and I just want to block PDFs. So I'm going to add the entire category. Okay, we will save this policy, and we will now have to activate it from the HCP. So go back to the HCP, and for that inside to outside rule, I want to enable deep packet inspection with my file policy, this one. So the inspection tab and the policy. So let's just save, let's push, and finally test. Okay, maybe before we actually push this policy, let me try to see if we can download the text file 172.16.10.100 ok.txt. This goes to the trash. Okay, I was able to get it. And let's try to get my PDF. Okay, so it looks like the file is being downloaded. So we will now activate this policy. I'm going to push this, deploy, and let's see what is going to be the change. So my expectation is going to be to still see the text file, but the PDF, once the PDF file is detected, I would expect my FTD to block the session. This rule, by the way, is configured with logging the events by default. So file events, we should see them in the analysis and then files, file events. Right, let me quickly check if the policy got deployed. It says all devices up to date. So it looks like we can now test this configuration once again. I'm going to download the text file, still have access, and then let's go for the PDF. That some packets will always make through the FTD because they are required to detect the file. We'll just wait for the end result. Maybe let's go ahead and take a look at the logs. Let's go to analysis, connection events. Let's start over here. Okay, and we see that we have an event which says action is blocked because of a file block. It's from router 2 to the test server. And it says that the browser is an application and the file is my PDF. So we should also see this under analysis files, file events. It should tell us how many files. Maybe let's also try to download it once again. So we see at some point it says broken pipe. The first few packets make it through, but not everything. and we see that one PDF file was blocked. Let's also take a look at captured files, like if we wanted to see what was the file. I use the storage, local storage option. I'm gonna click on the type, see the file. It says the file is my PDF, and I can now select this file and send it for further analysis, like with my local ClamAV engine. It says that the file is going to be analyzed locally and with the dynamic engine. Of course, you could also download this file if you wanted to perform analysis offline.